Humanity has always had a fascination with cautionary tales, as well as a penchant to disregard them. We think to ourselves that we're different from those people. We can succeed where those before us have failed. We can resist this or overcome that. But the reality is that as human beings, we are incredibly flawed and fallible. Most of us learn through our own mistakes. Or at least we hopefully do. But some people never quite reach that point where the ego gives way to the harsher truths of reality. Characters like Dexter DeShawn are an excellent example of this archetype, flying too high on wax wings. But despite his rise and dramatic fall, Dex did reach a whole new height in terms of how blinded one can be by their lust for power. Dex is one of those rare characters to survive a fall from grace in Night City. That's an achievement unto itself. But as we see throughout the events of Cyberpunk 2077, his second chance at a better life, a quiet life, was wasted. Just as wasted as he was after his final failure to understand that Night City does not suffer those who regret. Whether or not Dex is a Night City native, he is certainly interested in the wealth and power one can hustle from its streets. Dex is no stranger to the ruthless game played among its more successful players. And Dex, more than anything else, wanted to be one of those big players. Long before V and Jackie started their stint as mercs, Dex was an influential fixer in the afterlife circuit. Some people theorize that Dex was actually the big fixer in Pacifica before Mr. Hands, but I haven't been able to dig up any solid evidence on that assumption. But I do like that idea. To me, the idea that Dex was once such a heavy-hitting fixer fits nicely with his desperate attempts to get back into the upper echelons of Night City's fixers. Dex was known for aiming big with the gigs that he would take. Even if Dex had never worked as a mercenary himself, he was still excellent at assembling a team and identifying strengths and weaknesses of its members. And another thing to note is that Dex was not shy about throwing these mercenaries under the bus if things got a little too hot to handle. Dex would always get his cut of the action based on his charisma and his own network of connections. Very few mercs who worked with Dex at this time would ever contest the split of the earnings, because Dex had the supposed power to blacklist whoever he wanted, or, if he was in the mood, to have this mercenary taken out of the picture. He cultivated this veil of unpredictability, and it served him well enough to make a known name for himself, whether or not there was any stock in it. Ultimately, Dex developed a reputation of being a high-risk, high-reward kind of fixer, both in terms of the jobs he chose as well as for the people who worked with him. Dex had the surface persona of what he calls Mr. Cool. He explains this persona to V as a sort of veiled threat, implying that while he can be chill on the surface, Dex can be vicious if somebody ever tried to screw him over. And while this was probably a threat to be wary of once upon a time, most of Dex's bargaining power has fizzled out by 2077, which explains why Dex was scraping the barrel for a job that you would think he would want the best mercs in the business for. The reason for this is arguably one of the most well-known screw-ups of any fixer in Night City's recent memory, that we, the player, happen to know very little about. No character ever actually sits down and explains the whole incident in full detail, but there are some hints that help us piece together the puzzle that dragged Dex DeShawn to his deservedly underwhelming demise. Sometime between 2074 and 2075, Dex headed a gig in Pacifica. This gig started a gang war that would ravage the area, and also helped to create the combat zone that we all know and love by 2077. Pacifica's been screwed up for a long time, but this job apparently resulted in it being even worse, which is saying something. Details on this gig are scarce, but one of our best sources is a certain member of the animals in Rancho Coronado. Rhino is somebody you can fight in the boxing quest, Beat on the Brat. Rhino doesn't really have a lot to say to V about this gig, but rather you can read about it in an interview-style post by CD Projekt Red called Humans of Night City. In this fictional interview, Rhino details how she joined the animals and got into boxing, and it's actually here that we get one of the only detailed accounts of just what went down in Pacifica that sent Dex running. At least if we accept that this story is about that same gig. I personally think it is because there are too many details that line up very snug. In Rhino's interview, she says that this last gig of hers took place around 2 years ago, which does line up with the time that Dex left on his long-term vacation, as he likes to call it. Rhino actually mentions that the runner she worked with on this job was a girl with a fondness for classical philosophy. Rhino even says that she hopes this runner has retired to that Greek island she spoke about so often. I think it is pretty safe to say that this runner was T-Bug. Rhino continues to say that this job ended up blowing up in their face, as whatever they stole and whoever they stole it from were not too thrilled. The animals were out for blood. And Rhino only narrowly got her and Bug out of this situation because Rhino beat the animals who challenged her to a fight. And this is ironically how she ended up joining the animals, because that was one of their initiation rituals. Rhino also details that the fixer they were working with turned tail as soon as things got too hot. This fixer dropped off the face of the earth, leaving Rhino and T-Bug to fend for themselves. Whether these two ultimately managed to steal that item the gig was all about, or if it was software even, we don't know. But whatever happened, it is heavily implied that this fixer was Dex. The dates line up, Bug's involvement, and the sudden fixer disappearing from Night City after a really bad job in Pacifica. If this isn't about Dex, then it's a really crazy coincidence. Another bit of evidence that I think supports that this is in fact Dex's gig is the fact that Royce, when he mocks Dex, he mentions screwing over the animals in Pacifica, etc., which I think is a nice little cherry on top to this whole thing. The other thing that I want to note here is the possibility that Dex's screw-up actually helped the Voodoo Boys gain more power in Pacifica. It's hard to gauge the Voodoo Boys' level of power in the district because they are so secretive. We don't know anything about them, really, aside from what we see in their quests. But they do seem to have the most pull in the district, compared to animals or the scavs. The fact that Dex even feels comfortable contacting them to ask about Evelyn Parker says, to me at least, that Dex did not screw them over in the gang war. But one of the most interesting details from this whole theorized series of events that happened to do with Dexter's disastrous last job is the fact that I think Dexter actually fled to space! The very same place that he actually wants to flee to when the Konpeki heist is a disaster. This point alone sort of proves that Dexter genuinely has not learned anything from his past mistakes. He is repeating the process to a T. If V doesn't go to the bathroom in the no-tell motel, you can hear Dex making arrangements for a spaceflight escape for himself. The way Dex phrases this conversation to whoever he's speaking to implies that this is not the first time he has gone this route. The fact that Dex probably went to space 2 years ago implies that his original screw-up is way worse than we are explicitly told, and he likely left Rhino and T-Bug to fend for themselves. Dex mentions to V that Bug saved him at some point or other. I don't know if this has to do with the failed gig. It is interesting that T-Bug is still loyal to him after this potential abandonment. I think there's more information, I just haven't really been able to dig it up. But all in all, we can see Dex's history of biting off way more than he can chew. We see his inability to see through the mist of ambition, to know that he's just going to be stirring a pot that he's going to immediately regret. We see how easy Dex turns tail, and we see his tendency to throw others under the bus. And perhaps the most frustrating part of Dex's original failed gig is the fact that Dex did have a chance to start anew. Dex could have lived the quiet life if he actually wanted to. But even after his first major disaster, Dex still chooses to ignore his past mistakes and his own role in them. The only thing Dex takes from those events is his feeling of being wounded and bitter. He chose to repeat this same grave error, only on a much grander scale. Don't get me wrong, Cyberpunk 2077 is miles better than it used to be in so many ways, but Chapter 1 is full of holes. Like, the story still has its vital organs, so they're not plot-breaking holes, but you can't ignore these holes that are glaring at you about certain characters and certain things. Information that's half-mentioned and never explained. Chapter 1, at least to me, feels like it was completed last in development. And I think that's because they weren't sure if they'd be able to tie up all the loose ends that they start in the first chapter later on in the game. My biggest reason for thinking this is the way CDPR treated Phantom Liberty. I think the detail and the effort and the time that was allowed to be put into Phantom Liberty gives us a glimpse of what I think the developers really wanted the whole game to be like. They had time to make the story and the characters. In that sense, Phantom Liberty was better than the rest of the game, at least for me. Because the time and effort and detail was there and you could see it. And I love 2077. I think it has one of the better stories in video games that I've played. There's amazing characters and amazing quests, and the world building is phenomenal. But when you sit it next to the sheer level of detail of Phantom Liberty, and know about the troublesome time frame and burnout that occurred in the base game's creation, you can really feel the difference. 2077 is still phenomenal. It's just the fact that video game developers are often not given the respect due to what they have to do in order to make a quality product. The fact that the devs at CDPR were able to make the story as good as it is despite all these roadblocks is incredible. But you can still unfortunately see where them being rushed by the powers that be unfortunately left some voids in the game. For me, Phantom Liberty feels like an apology to the base game for not treating it with the level of care and love and detail that they wished they could have. The theory that I've half-baked in my head is that in the original plot of the game, the Voodoo Boys hired Dex to be an unsuspecting fall guy that would start a war in their favor. I like to think that the Voodoo Boys maybe saw Dex as the easiest fixer to manipulate, and they could convince him to smack the hornet's nest that was the animals. Maybe how T-Bug saved Dex was by forging evidence that blamed Scavs for the whole incident, at least for a while. Maybe because T-Bug was from Coastview, she had contacts in the Voodoo Boys that helped him out last second, or maybe she was a Voodoo Boy, and her job was ensuring that the gang had no digital footprint in this gig. Maybe T-Bug even saved Dex for her own ulterior motives, whether she was a part of the Voodoo Boys or not. Maybe she just saw Dex as a way to make money in order for her to someday retire to Crete. Even I'll be the first to admit that all of these half-baked ideas of mine are up in the air and pure speculation. But my overall point with having this kind of speculation is that this story feels like so much got cut. There are bits of this story that are left out in a way that doesn't feel natural. Like, you know when there's a setup in a story and you get the details peppered in about past events that you eventually put together and then you have your aha moment realizing what it all means. Dex's failure in Pacifica feels like it was intended to be one of those stories, but unfortunately never got off the ground. I feel like they didn't have enough time to tell it, so they axed it. One of the only traces we see of the potential of this story is T-Bug in the 2019 cinematic trailer, shown at E3 2019. This trailer was released about a year before the game's final release, after many delays. We see T-Bug in this trailer even resembling some of her original concept art. This gives me Maman Brigitte vibes, and I'm sad that they got rid of the coat. T-Bug looked cool. In this trailer, T-Bug betrays V. And some might say that this is just a trailer and it's not canon, and I actually do agree. I think you're right. This trailer is no longer canon. But I think at one point it was. This is a pretty deliberate thing, having T-Bug here in this scene where she is otherwise dead, her design being what it is as well. I think initially T-Bug was intended to betray V, siding with Dex, and who knows what kind of history those two had together. I think that the devs had even more ideas for this storyline that just unfortunately could not be implemented in the final game, and it sucks. I tried really hard to come up with a reasonable theory for just what happened in Pacifica, but as I was thinking of it and trying to string together information, the one thought that kept coming to me is the feeling of all of these absences that were never filled. I will say, I do unfortunately think a lot of Dex's story, and T-Bug's as well, especially T-Bug's, was a victim of the crunch of the Cyberpunk 2077 dev time, but at the same time, when it comes to Dex at least, they did do a good job of leaving him mostly intact. Please tell me what you think of this thought of mine in the comments. If you have theories, I want to hear them, so please tell me. I am fascinated by all of these unknowns, and if anybody knows anything, because you guys tend to know things that make me go, whoa, like, it's always interesting, so let me know in the comments. Okay. Back to analysis time. After Dex fled Night City, his reputation crashed. Everybody in the mercenary scene of Night City knew that whatever happened in Pacifica, it had to do with Dex. The combat zone is as bad as it is now, in part because of Dexter DeShawn's big screw-up. Because he turned tail and fled, this likely made things look even worse. For him to flee, that said a lot about how much power this Mr. Cool actually had. Dex had clearly not planned for this failure or any potential blowback. Dex's true nature as a buffoon who utilized smoke and mirrors to hide his true ineptitude was finally exposed by himself. In his haste to reach the top, partnered with his own puffed-up impression of his own success, ultimately led him right back to the bottom. Dex was impatient and greedy, and he paid the price. Even though we know very little about the Pacifica gig, it's fairly safe to assume that there were many red flags that went right over Dexter's head, because that's exactly what happened with the Konpeki heist. The fixer Rogue even saw that this job was doomed, hence why she didn't take it. Dex's absence from Night City was as much for his own protection as it was an exile. None of the mercs he used to deal with would even look in his direction now. The fact that even Maelstrom ridicules Dex When Maelstrom is often looked down on themselves says a lot about where his reputation is. When Dex returns to Night City at the start of 2077, he cannot handle being viewed as a failure. I think Dex has a huge ego, and I think this is worsened by the fact that he does not have the chops to physically and mentally discipline and push himself to go and get glory for himself. Dex is too scared to take actual action, but he still wants the glory of being a Night City legend. Dex is good at talking and reading people, but that only goes so far. The only people who are dazzled by him now are mercs fresh on the scene. Mercenaries who were not in on what the veterans knew. Fortune hunting and glory-hungry kids like Jackie and V. Dex was now forced to work with flimsy nobodies to work his gigs. The reason why he took the Konpeki heist when he did was because he was desperate to rebuild his reputation. He wanted to be back in the big leagues, and he hated being looked down on by those who were smart enough to know that he was full of shit. One could argue that fixers are no different from your average Night City predator. They rely on the skills of other people, on the lives of other people. But even if you look at them that way, Dexter was a whole other kind of animal. One that, for a time, was able to talk the talk even if he didn't walk the walk. But in a city where you either evolve or you die, Dexter never did grow. Instead, he sat in his own failures and allowed himself to break down into a weaker and weaker person. Dex was ultimately unable to accept his own failures and actually use those failures and the knowledge they would have given him to build him into the fixer that he had always wanted to be. Thank you very, very much for watching this one, guys. I really, really appreciate it. This is part 1 of 2 of my Dex DeShawn analysis. Initially, I was going to do one big long video, but then I decided that, oh god, this script is too long, so I'm going to cut it in half. And even after that point, part 1 continued to grow. The whole Pacifica mystery just dug a deeper hole as I went, and I was like, oh god. Yeah, I'm sure I missed something, so if I did, or if you guys know of anything to do with Dex's Pacifica disaster, let me know in the comments. The next video will be about the Konpeki heist, as well as all of the little details the developers put in concerning Dexter being a traitor, him being kind of slimy, all these little details that you only notice on subsequent playthroughs. Despite what I think is a lot of cut content, they did a really good job still making Dexter feel like a very well thought out character he was. I'd say T-Bug is the one who suffered the most of any character from what I think is a case of cut content. Let me know what you think of cut content in Cyberpunk in general. If you know of any interesting cut content, I would especially be interested. I think that could be a really interesting kind of story video to do. Also, I just want to say I'm sorry if my green screen's a little fuzzy. I'm still figuring out how to use it in Premiere, but holy crap, this thing is pretty cool. I'll just put Easy Pete in the background and thank you very much to my members. You guys are awesome. Thank you to Mika, Mikularest001, Lock Proposals Big Day, the Hot Dog Man he's the glue that keeps us together, Pater Tot, which reminds me of Pop-Tarts, Frankie, Aiden Papour, who has a fun name to say, and Benjamin. Thank you, Benjamin Scoville, for being the latest member. Thank you. Welcome to the Hot Dog Man Club. Oh no. That's the next tier, is the Hot Dog Men. The Hot Dog Men. Oh my god. I will see you next week with part 2 of Dex DeShawn's analysis. Thank you very, very much for watching, for liking, for commenting, for subscribing. All of it helps me out a lot. So thank you very, very much, guys. Have a good one. Goodbye.